the home of chieftains, the home of knights, a location for great lords and kings, fought over for 800 years or so, a castle on the knife edge. Today's story is the story of Dundrum Castle. The name Dundrum actually means Fort of the Ridge in Irish, and you'll see why when we look at the maps. But first, I think it'll be useful to get a wee bit of history. In 1169, obviously the Normans, led by Robert Fitzstephen, crossed from Wales and captured Wexford, told in my first novel, SWORDLAND. Then a year later, Strongbow arrived, again from Wales, from Chepstow in his case, and captured the cities of Waterford and Dublin, all of which were in the southeastern portion of Ireland. A year after that, King Henry II had to get in on the action, deciding to cross to Ireland to make sure that Strongbow and Fitzstephen and all the Irish princes would submit to his rule. And as he made his way around the southwestern and southeastern portions of Ireland, many of the great kings of Ireland came out to declare their submission to him. Amongst the knights that followed Henry across the sea from England to Ireland in 1171 was a 20-something, hugely powerful, pious knight called John de Courcy. Now, John de Courcy was the second son of a family from northern Somerset, in the region of the Quantock Hills, in England. And as such, he wouldn't have been eligible at that time to inherit any of his father's lands. So he was a man who was going to have to forge his own path in life. And oh boy, did he. Over the next few years, we sort of lose track of John a little bit. He was in Ireland, he was in England, and he was in France on the king's business. But in January 1177, he just finally was able to make real these ambitions of his, and he led a little tiny army of about just over 400, about 20 knights, we can presume 60 esquires or half-armoured knights, and 300 archers / infantry. And he led them out of the garrison of Dublin, north through the land of Meath, which was then held by another Norman knight called Hugh de Lacy, and across the Mourne Mountains into what is now Northern Ireland, but in those days was the land of Ulster, from which we derive the name of the province, the northern province of Ireland, Ulster. And Ulster in those days, or the small tiny kingdom in that corner, was ruled by the Rory MacDunleavy, a head of a very powerful family, and his seat of power was at Downpatrick, sort of ecclesiastical administrative capital of this little kingdom. And John de Courcy and his knights stormed that capital and took it and began turning it into the kind of their base from which to rule Ulster, which we'll now call Ulster. John, obviously, when like any good self-respecting Norman, when he's conquered one place, he immediately starts setting up more castles, and in his case these was Motte and Bailey castles, and we see evidence of Motte and Bailey castles all over eastern Ulster. Really from the north of County Antrim right down to the south of Down, and even into County Armagh. Again, we know John hadn't asked for permission of the king or anybody to invade Ulster. He had simply gone off and done it on his own back with this tiny army. And we know that he was considered himself an independent prince, because he began minting his own coinage. He started making marriage licenses, or he married the daughter of the King of Man, forming an alliance really with Man and Norway to protect himself from England, I presume, without the king's permission. Again, he did whatever any good Norman would do and started setting up castles. His biggest was probably the existing castle at Carrickfergus, but the subject of our chat today is the castle at Dundrum. Dundrum means in Irish, a Dundroma is a fort of the ridge, and you'll see why when we get in a little bit closer on the map. You can see here Dundrum, where it is in the south eastern corner of Northern Ireland, and it's on a little bay right on the coast called Dundrum Bay. There's actually a larger Dundrum Bay, and then if we go a little bit inland, we can see that there's a smaller Dundrum Bay. The castle itself is built on a little hillock just north of the modern town of Dundrum, and it's probable that that was fortified by the Irish before the coming of the Normans, almost certainly, because it is just too good to miss. And you can see as well the why this the name of the town is Dundrum, the ridge running east-west from the castle. The castle is actually built on a hill about 200 feet high, and well, you can see from if we look at the satellite images, why Dundrum later lost its importance to the other big shipping towns in the area, like Ardglass and Kilkeel and Warren Point. It's very silty. It's probably not good for shipping unless you have this type of ships that the Normans had in those days, which would have been much like the Viking longships, very low draft, and was able to traverse these type of bays very easily. So the first castle was probably built around 1177 by John de Courcy at Dundrum. The oldest part of the castle that still exists is this outer wall, the outer curtain wall on the upper ward, which is built by John. And it's we're talking 4 feet thick, and it surrounds an area probably 50 paces across, I would say. The second oldest structure was built in the 1200s, and it was this keep. But John de Courcy, actually, to describe how the keep came into existence, John de Courcy actually fell out with King John very soon after, and in 1204 King John, the King of England, decided to send Hugh de Lacy, the son of Hugh de Lacy, Lord of Meath, to really dislodge John from Ulster. And in 1204 Hugh was able to do this. John fled to the Isle of Man and returned a year later, and he attempted to retake Dundrum Castle, but he found that his defences that he had built were just too strong, and he couldn't take any of the castles that he had himself built, and he ended up living out his life and dying in not squalor but certainly ignominy, which of course was not to his taste. Anyway, the de Lacys, they built the keep, which is currently about 50 feet tall. It's 2 stories, but it was originally apparently 3 stories tall, so very much taller than it is today. A well was actually discovered inside the keep in the 1950s, which obviously just shows is very important. If this castle was besieged, a healthy water supply is very, very important, and that means that you can really last in the castle as long as you have food to keep the people who are in there. In the 1210s, King John actually now fell out with Hugh de Lacy and expelled him from Ulster. Hugh was able to retake Ulster in the 1220s, however, and was subsequently made Earl of Ulster. His line came to an end not that long afterwards, and the Earldom of Ulster actually passed into the very powerful de Burgh family. However, I suspect that the gatehouse, in addition to the keep, I think the gatehouse, the very dramatic two-sided gatehouse, was probably the work of the de Lacys as well, considering it's quite similar to something that you can see at the front of Carrickfergus Castle. And while it looks kind of forlorn nowadays, you have to imagine this castle in the 1200s and 1300s as a real bustling centre for all these people and houses and commerce and agriculture in the area. There'd be servants and knights and churchmen roaming around. It really would be a centre of activity in the area, and we can see the sort of the idea of commerce when we see the remains of the lime kiln down in the lower ward, what might have been the bailey of the Motte and Bailey Castle at one time. And it really, it's some way to remember the enterprising nature of these invading Normans. In any event, it was probably the de Burghs who added this lower ward, which would have held all these administrative buildings and a few more comfortable buildings and granaries and that sort of stuff. And like the de Lacys, they would have appointed a constable to run the day-to-day business in the area. By the 1330s, the de Burghs had become embroiled in a civil war with their cousins from Connaught. And at this time, Dundrum actually fell from the family's grasp and into the ownership or control of another local Gaelic family called the McGuinnesses of Ive, from whom the brewing family of Guinness, very famous in Ireland, arise. So throughout the 14th and even the end of the 13th century, sorry, from the 14th and into the 15th century, and even up to the 16th century, the McGuinness family were in control of the castle. We don't know a great deal about it from that period. However, in around the 1517, I think it was, the all-powerful Earls of Kildare, the Fitzgeralds, were able to take ownership of the castle and establish their semi-rule over Lacal as a kind of base, their base in Ulster. However, they fell from power in the 1530s, fell out with the Tudors, and the McGuinnesses were able to re-establish their control. And it wasn't until 1601 and the end of the 9 Years' War that Lord Mountjoy, this English general, was able to capture the castle and put it under Crown control. Again, the Crown's reach can only stretch so far, so they offloaded Dundrum to a chap called Edward Cromwell, very famous surname. He was a descendant of Thomas Cromwell, who had been the Lord Chancellor of England under Henry VIII, and if you've read Hilary Mantel's books, you'll know a bit about him. He was actually made Viscount of Lacal, this area surrounding Dundrum, in 1624, and later Earl of Ardglass as well, but was unable to keep up the payments that required to keep such his lands going, and ended up selling it to a chap called Sir Francis Blundell in 1636. He was the one who built this really rather fine mansion in the Lower Ward, which we see today, which is obviously a 17th century creation. But really, he probably should have spent his money on defences rather than comfort, because in 1641, a huge uprising happened across all of Ireland, and Sir Francis Blundell was forced to flee Ireland, and he lost his lands once again back to the McGuinnesses, who had been overall the owners of or in control of Dundrum for most of its history. They took up residence, the McGuinnesses took up residence again in the castle and held it for the next, I don't know, we're talking next decade, until the parliamentarians under Oliver Cromwell, irony, came rolling through the area in 1651 and recaptured it, and gave it back eventually to Sir Francis Blundell, whose family held it, I think, until the 1780s, when it passed into the Hill family, another Cromwellian family who were huge landowners in the area. In the 1790s, the Hills would actually become Marquesses of Downshire, Downshire being the modern county, or County Down, and their ownership continued of Dundrum until the 1950s, when it was handed over to the state, and and that's how we find it today. So I hope you enjoyed that little look at Dundrum Castle. It really is a lovely place to go and visit, and not just because of the fine 800-year-old architecture and fortifications. It is one of the most gorgeous views you'll ever see over Dundrum town and the bay, Murlough Bay, and over to the Mourne Mountains, and is very, very much worth a visit if you have the chance to visit the area. My name's Ruadh Butler. I'm an author of novels set in the 12th century, at the start of the 12th century, and if you want to find out a wee bit more about those novels, you can check out the links in the description. Also, do consider having a bash of the button and the bell and all that nonsense, and subscribing to the channel. Hopefully we'll be able to get a few more videos out. I say this every time, but it is one of those things where I'm going to try and get a few more videos out about the Norman invasion and the various aspects of the Norman and the families of the Norman invasion of Ireland.